So today, I'll be talking about patterns of coastal change in New Jersey for the most part. I've been picking away at different aspects of change in the coastal ecosystem for the last few years. And I think a lot of what I'll talk about, although it's New Jersey specific, will apply to many other locations. First, I wanted to mention, my stake in coastal conservation, working at Forsythe Refuge, which is the headquarters about 40 miles north of Cape May and near Atlantic City, where there's nearly 50,000 acres of coastal habitat, the vast majority of which is salt marsh throughout Barnegat Bays and bays around Atlantic City. And today I'll be focusing on South Jersey back bays for the most part, and as well as the Delaware Bay, from Barnegat Bay down to Cape May, really highlighting Barnegat Bay and Delaware Bay as counterpart estuaries. Barnegat Bay highly developed, whereas Delaware Bay currently is fairly undeveloped. And I want to explore the factors influencing the pace of erosion around these coasts, and then trying to get down to understanding where and how we may have lost resilience at the site level, as a result of centuries of human use of the coast, and then hopefully, getting us toward collectively, improving our intervention strategies as we work. I was out on the Barnegat Bay last week and saw this scene and just saw it as a kind of a motivating example of what we're working to avoid. The eventuality where there's really no room to move and it's a hardened coast. It also reminds me that a lot of times we're thinking of site level interventions. Many of our responsibilities and roles focus on individual sites. And that's, obviously great. But it's also occurring to me that, we have to think about the landscape scale as well, because there's different stakes at different scales. The stakes at this landscape scale, in this example, there's a recent study in the Barnegat Bay showing that as we get increasing levels of erosion, we may reach a point where the hydrology shifts in the Barnegat Bay in a permanent way. And it becomes harder and harder to retain sediment and retain the marshes we have. So the stakes are incredibly high to start mitigating erosion, both at the local and landscape scale. And, and this, of course, is in the context of sea level rise. We can't directly address sea level rise itself, but we do what we can to increase the resilience of these coastal habitats to that advancing sea level rise and storms and everything that comes along with it. And I'll be talking a lot about marshes today because most of these shorelines are marsh dominated. If we set aside the Atlantic Coast barrier beaches, we're really talking about vast marshes across this landscape, that are dominating the shoreline. And one of the things I've been working on over the last few years is documenting patterns of marsh change, both in the Delaware Bay and this coast from Barnegat Bay to Cape May. And what we're seeing, is moderate losses of marshes, about 6% since 1970. But the interesting thing to note from a living shorelines perspective is that 70% of that marsh loss is due to edge erosion, loss at the edge. The other counterpart, 30%, is interior open water where you have marsh turning to ponds and things like that. And with regard to that interior open water, we see it corresponds really nicely with tidal range. So where you have tinier tidal range, you tend to be losing more of your marsh in the interior compared to where you have greater tidal range. And in this landscape, this corresponds to a north to south gradient. So we have very small tidal range in Barnegat Bay, and it increases as you get down to Cape May and around into Delaware Bay. Interestingly, edge loss doesn't seem to have much to do with tidal range. What it does relate to is actually the amount of edge exposure you have. So for a given area of marsh, the one with more edge is going to lose more marsh at the edge. And so this hints to some degree at that positive feedback loop and the tipping point that I mentioned earlier, where you're, as you get more edge, you get more marsh loss, and so on. So it's a sort of an increasing rate of loss. So cause for concern. We're already, seeing a bit of a positive feedback loop. And here's an example of our marsh fringe shorelines. This is Barnegat Bay, famous decoy carver Harry Shorts demonstrating how to use a Barnegat Bay sneak box. And then here we go. This is essentially the factor that's really directly driving a lot of this edge erosion, and it's simply wind-driven waves across these coastal bays of varying width, from the very wide Delaware Bay to some of these narrower back bays. But the data research has shown that salt marshes really can only exist in a stable way when the wave climate is very calm. So anytime you have a little bit of wave action, you're going to have an eroding salt marsh. And in many cases, where you have salt marsh and a lot of wave action, you have beaches girding those salt marsh shorelines, as we'll see as I go on in the talk. Here's an example of edge erosion along the intercoastal waterway, and just something I've been thinking about is boat wake a lot. We have these wind-driven waves, but also heavy boat use of these back bays, and this could be a fairly significant impact on our shorelines as well. So to me, this indicates a bit of a paradox. Why do we have so much marsh that can't handle much wave action exposed to so much wave action? So especially Delaware Bay, huge fetch, definitely Barnegat Bay as well, large areas of fetch. And so what I would propose is that we have multiple lines of defense. Say, if you imagine the pre-colonial coastal landscape, we had multiple lines of defense that serve to function to, gentle down that wave action. And some of these lines of defense, have been weakened over time. Here's our, prototypical system where we've got, intertidal, subtidal oysters and eelgrass and intact beaches with dunes and salt marshes. And I see this. Sorry to bring up COVID again, but you may have heard of the Swiss cheese model, where you've got multiple lines of defense that add up to reducing transmission rate. And I think it's an apt analogy for what I'm talking about here, where you've got these dispersed varying lines of defense that occur in a mosaic around the landscape that ultimately ends up into gentling down the wave action when it finally gets to that salt marsh. So that's essentially my hypothesis for and a sort of operating theory for reconstructing this coastal landscape. So we've got sea level rise interacting with other human impacts that have happened, are happening in present, past, to degrade this habitat, and potentially we're seeing a faster rate of retreat than we would expect, if this was an intact landscape. And so I just want to step through some vignettes and examples here. Oysters are a bit mysterious because the exploitation was so extensive so early on that we don't have a lot of data, charts, graphs to lean on. We have anecdotes, and then we have a few cases documented evidence of the extent of oyster reefs, like you see here in the Chesapeake Bay. And when you look at this map of Maryland and Virginia, you can imagine, if oysters were that extensive, they probably had a pretty significant sheltering effect. But this account from Winslow and from North Carolina already, as at the late 1800s, really decrying the exploitation. And of course, that with disease, really we lost this historic extent. And it's hard to imagine it. Here's a report from Ingersoll, where he helps us imagine it a bit. He paints quite a picture of the marshes really bristling with oysters, all the way along creeks and ponds into the interior. Just about everywhere in great profusion, we saw intertidal oysters. And then he goes on to describe the 50 miles of coast that he covered, everywhere spotted with oyster beds, from the shallow waters all the way out into the subtidal waters. So we don't have maps like I showed you of the Chesapeake Bay for the Delaware Bay that I'm aware of. but we can imagine that these oysters played a similar role in sheltering that marsh-dominated shoreline, which now is completely exposed to miles of fetch in many cases. And as oysters are and using oysters to shelter the shoreline is mainstream technology for living shoreline practice. And of course, we can't recover these pre-colonial extents, but we can be inspired, by the role oysters do and did play to use that function in a targeted way to shelter the shoreline. Seagrass is another, feature that can really play a big role ecosystem services wise, as far as gently down wave action. In New Jersey, the epicenter of eelgrass distribution, at least in modern times, is the Barnegat Bay, and we have, we certainly know that the extent of this eelgrass has been declining over time. It's not clear where we are at right now with the density and distribution of eelgrass, but as I understand it, it's we're going to get really good information soon here in New Jersey. But eelgrass seems to play a pretty important role in the Barnegat Bay, based on those folks that gave us the doom and gloom of the pending tipping point. They also did another study that offered a solution, which is seagrass. They did some modeling work to show that the rates of erosion we're seeing in the Barnegat Bay are exacerbated by the loss of seagrass. So it seems like a fairly clear imperative to work toward getting this function back. Folks in Virginia, have shown that eelgrass can attenuate wave action and bed shear stress, and of course, along with it come the ecosystem services that include carbon storage and habitat for other species such as bay scallops. And it's just interesting to note that the heart of the eelgrass distribution fits like a puzzle piece into this area of highest fetch, where the wind waves would be most pronounced in the Delaware Bay. But I've noticed that I'm not an expert in eelgrass and its history, but it seems to be this is from the West Coast and East Coast, some ambivalence about eelgrass from the various user groups in the estuaries. But so maybe some reconciliation work needs to be done to really convince everyone that it's in everyone's best interest to have these eelgrass, sort of maintaining the estuary as it is today, and preventing that tipping point. Tidal flats don't get as much attention, regulatory wise or even habitat protection wise, but they are a unique feature in their own right that plays a unique habitat role. For example, we mentioned Cape may be important for migratory birds. These flats are incredible habitat for shorebirds, and this map comes from an international map of global tidal flats that came out a few years ago, showing South Jersey having a real dense extent of intertidal mud and sand flats. Interestingly, not as much in the Barnegat Bay. So where the eelgrass tails off, the tidal flats fill in. And again, I was curious to see how these flats play a role in protecting the edge from erosion. So I've done some analyses of sampling areas of erosion since 1970, looking at fetch in that mudflat map and finding what we'd expect. Areas of greater open water have higher rates of erosion. But also, given the same amount of open water, if you have intertidal flats there, wider tidal flats will reduce your erosion rate. So again, these play a role and can be maintained or enhanced to enhance that role. And okay, so as we move into this latter half of the talk, I'll be spending a lot of time talking about salt marshes and weaving in some beaches and dunes, because a lot of these back bays are the salt marshes and beaches and dunes are coupled. They're intertwined with each other. And salt marshes, they've had their share of past uses. About 80% of all our marshes in the Northeast have been ditched for various reasons, including mosquito control. And then some proportion of those have been impounded, again, throughout the Northeast. This is Barnegat Bay, a place on the refuge where I work. That was where salt hay was being harvested in 1974. You can see those hay bales, hopefully, down there. And then in Delaware Bay, I would say there's nowhere that impoundment of marshes for agriculture reached such a landscape scale. At least 50% of the marshes on the New Jersey side were impounded for agriculture, and probably a quarter to a third on the Delaware side of the bay. Here's an example from the Morris River of a marsh that today is Spartina alterniflora marsh. At this time in 1909, we had corn, strawberries, potatoes, and upland hay growing out there. So they were able to get this marsh dry enough and fresh enough, so it was essentially an upland crop producer. And then relevant to the shoreline, most of the shoreline in these impounded areas was being used as an impoundment berm and a place to put drainage infrastructure. Something I want to highlight about human impacts to the marshes, I think a unifying concept to really let sink in is that anything that dried out a marsh, ditching, impoundment, tidal restriction, all of them designed to just make a marsh drier, what that does is it shifts the soil conditions from anaerobic, where there's low oxygen, to aerobic, where you're exposing those accumulated peat soils to oxygen. And so those peat soils have accumulated in some cases over thousands of years, and that becomes exposed to oxygen and begins to decompose. So you start seeing a deflation of the marsh elevation. And so it's a matter of degrees. If it's a ditch marsh, maybe you don't lose as much elevation, but an impounded marsh you do, as I'll show you. And this can occur anywhere peat soils exist. For example, this is an example from the Everglades. But this could easily be a diagram of a Delaware Bay salt marsh, for example, where over time you're working within these levees, and your elevation is getting lower and lower, and it becomes more and more unsustainable to keep doing what you're doing, and eventually you have to let it go. And that's where we are on a landscape scale in the Delaware Bay, where we have most of the farms have been abandoned at this point, and we've got what was once a highly developed, highly managed landscape abandoned essentially. And so these elevation losses are evident in the Delaware Bay, up to 2 or 3 feet of elevation loss, and maybe more in some places. And so really, I mean, we're, in 2100, we're expecting about 3 feet of sea level rise. So some of these marshes out here have already essentially endured 3 feet of sea level rise. Rather than the water rising, the land is sank. And there's consequences for the shoreline to elevation loss in the marsh, because again, you've got this beach and berm girding that marsh from that wind wave action. And as sea level rise progresses, we would expect transgression inland, where you have the beach realign itself. And you would hope that the beach and dune and berm like hold themselves together in shape. But what happens if you've lost elevation in the marsh? When that beach tries to move inland, it has to first backfill that lost elevation, and you have a gradual decrease of that berm height. And then you have overwash occurring more often, and sand loss into the back of the marsh. And here's a pretty dramatic example from the Delaware Bay. In 1977, this area was an entirely managed landscape. Every bit of that is under impoundment and water control, and a storm breached the shoreline. And because of the fragility of that interior marsh and low elevation, the entire a mile of shoreline simply disintegrated, and as well, permanent loss of hundreds of acres of marsh. So the results can be dramatic and seen in many examples around the Bay Shore. But here's a slightly less dramatic case I wanted to highlight. in yellow is an area that breached in a similar way to that example I just showed you. And then to the north, a green area that has remained intact. And just to go back in time, it was a small coastal watershed with limited drainages. When it was impounded, then those drainages were increased to get it drier. And they were designed to get water off the area, but once the breaches occurred, then they function to bring water in as well. That, coupled with all the elevation loss, means much more water volume coming into that watershed than you would expect normally. And what that means for the shoreline is a lot of push and pull as this water tries to get in and out with the tides. And so what we see on the shoreline is a gradual flattening out of that dune profile and a really rapid retreat of the shoreline, essentially runaway beach transgression, because that beach barrier really has nothing to support it. And that's what it looks like on the ground. So just sand pouring into the back of the marsh. And these sites have a very limited sand supply. Places like Barnegat Bay or Delaware Bay, they're working with a limited supply. There's no river of sand coming down the coast like you see in the Atlantic coast. So when you see in this aerial view almost continuous overwash fans, it's not a great thing, because that's a permanent loss of sand from the sand limited system. On the Atlantic coast, there's increasing recognition that these kinds of overwash events are good for habitat rejuvenation for a lot of wildlife. But the resilience is there on that Atlantic coast, and there's enough sand in the system to help knit them together as well. And here's our control area just to the north, just to show you how things have progressed there. This area actually is like that ideal schematic I showed earlier on, where the beach is really holding its shape while still moving inland. And this would be the ideal beach and dune that would behave this way. And the difference in shoreline retreat is immense. So this is indicating that this stretches of shoreline experience the same physical factors of storms and sea level rise and wind, but it's just simply the condition of the shoreline really affects that rate of retreat. And so, yeah, it implies that restoration could help, reduce that rate of retreat. Just a few more vignettes related to beaches and dunes along these marsh-dominated coasts. When we have a ditch marsh, the ditches too work as sand sinks, where when you have horizontal ditches that are horizontal, parallel to the coastline, that when the coastline migrates inland, it falls into these horizontal ditches, and so you have a net loss of sand there. And then when you have perpendicular ditches, these create a weak point in the shoreline, which allows sand to be lost initially into these ditches, but then you can also have breaches. And then you have an increasing number of shoreline discontinuities. And this is what we see in these formerly impounded landscapes, a lot more shoreline openings, a lot wider shoreline openings, because due to all that elevation loss, you have a lot more water volume having to come in and out. So the shoreline openings widen to accommodate that. And then you have these shoals that form at these discontinuities that are a sand sink. So all these cumulative losses of sand basically shreds that armor that the salt marsh edge once had. And then you have more salt marsh edge exposed. And I think there's similar things going on in the Barnegat Bay. Like I mentioned earlier, this is a highly developed landscape, but many shoreline openings due to that development, in many cases, marinas and things like that, and as well as impoundment and ditching. So we have lots of shoreline discontinuities, and then a gradually decreasing extent of beaches. This is just a rough attempt at understanding changes in beach area. But the west shore of the Barnegat Bay seems to have lost a lot of beach over time. So more edge exposed. Toggling back to the Delaware Bay, I showed that little case study, but I wanted to see if this was a bay-wide pattern. So I looked at sites on both sides of the bay, Delaware Bay and Delaware side and New Jersey side. and found that indeed all those areas with a history of impoundment have dune berm heights that are trending downward, and so implying more overwash, and also greater rates of shoreline retreat. And interestingly, simply grid ditch marsh also had greater rates of shoreline retreat. And I think that's a interesting new finding. Okay, so I mean, to me, this implies, you know, we have the scale and scope of the problem is immense. You know, the impacts of salt marshes across the Northeast and beyond are great. And, you know, the amount of degradation of these living systems and physical systems that girded the shoreline. So a lot of work to do. But, you know, at least it points to the fact that, as someone mentioned earlier in the opening remarks, multiple strategies, you know, would help put, you know, the coastline back together and increase this resilience. So, you know, starting with those features like oyster reefs that help break down that wave action, but then putting together that salt marsh elevation and hydrology to a more natural state, and you know, and putting our beach and dune profiles back together, and recognizing that you know, some of this stuff has to work at a larger scale than just a site. So developing that mindset, and with the ultimate goal to reverse the human impacts. You know, these errors we've made over time that have reduced the resilience of the coast, not just the sea level rise, but just the everyday run-of-the-mill wind-driven wave erosion. And so we have to do that to at least be prepared for sea level rise. And of course, you know, this requires every capacity we have, every new idea, every technology we have, including, you know, engineering technologies that help integrate that developed coast with the natural coast. And these things, examples of biomimicry that I thought were fascinating. One at the top is synthetic eelgrass that, of course, works to break wave action down, but it also helps oysters establish themselves in that intertidal zone, like it helps them bridge the gap between subtidal and marsh edge habitats. And then the example below is a matrix designed to mimic the root matrix of eelgrass, which it helps eelgrass establish better, and then also creates a substrate for oysters to get through that, to exist in that intertidal area as well. And then, of course, you know, when we have urgent high hazard situations, you know, have to, you know, go with hybrid or hard infrastructure to help stabilize, you know, a site long enough for, hopefully, for restoration to proceed as well, you know, in concert with these harder structures designed to protect infrastructure at great risk. So to conclude, yeah, just want to reiterate that we've got, you know, a pretty big scale of degradation to address in a variety of ways, but integrated shoreline restoration, you know, a strategy that's, you know, got multiple tactics across different parts of the landscape can recover this lost resilience. And then, you know, recognizing that we, you know, all of us come to this with different roles, working at different scales and different stakes, and just understanding that that we work together, you know, like at the site level and beyond to get to these sort of ecosystem level, large scale restoration projects. So with that, I'll end. I really appreciate the time to speak with you today, and hope to see some of you at the field trips later today.